I am back and working on my Subaru EJ25 motor. So if you haven't watched the last few episodes, pretty much my motor blew up. The engine decided to yeet a piece of my valve, so I had to pull the motor, remove the heads, and rebuild them. And now that everything's fixed, it's time for the motor to go back together. Alright, so I have my freshly rebuilt head here. I've got new head bolts, new head gasket. I've got my torque wrench. We've got the motor here ready. So I'm going to get started by installing the passenger side head first. I'm going to lay in a new head gasket, then place the head on top. I'll unpackage 6 of my 12 head bolts, and then set them into place on the head. So now I have to tighten the bolts in an A, B, C, D, E, F pattern. I'll first tighten all the bolts in order to 21.4 foot-pounds. Then I'll tighten them further in order to 50.9 foot-pounds. Then I'll break them all loose by 180 degrees in reverse order, and then I'll break them loose again by another 180 degrees. This process pre-stretches the bolts, avoiding having to come back to tighten them at a later time after running the engine through a break-in cycle. The bolts have to be retightened in order by 36.1 foot-pounds. And then in the next step, the bolts have to be tightened by 80 to 90 degrees in order. So I'm going to mark the top of the bolt with a pen. Yeah, sure, that's 90 degrees. Last turn, I'm going to turn them another 40 to 45 degrees. Alright, and then finally, just bolts A and B have to be tightened another 45 degrees. And voila! The passenger side head is now fully installed and reattached. Now I'll lay in the cams on this side and place the cam holders to hold my cams in place. I'm going to wait until the other head is installed to torque down the cams completely. So now I'm going to flip the engine over and repeat the head installation on the other side. Alright, so next up, I'm going to finish locking the cams in. I just have the bolts like kind of hand tightened here just to hold everything in place. But what I'm going to do now is actually apply the RTV. I have new hardware to replace all these bolts holding in the cam caps. First, I'll remove the cams, clean them, and all the journals on both the cam and the head. Then I'll cover the cams and all the contact points with assembly oil. Now I'll add oil onto all the contact points on the front cam cap. Before adding black RTV, I'll wipe the edges of the front cam cap with a towel that's lightly soaked in parts cleaner to make sure that it's free of all oils. Then, following the factory manual, I'll apply RTV in all the necessary locations. Lastly, I'll install the cap onto the head using new factory hardware. So as you can see, the caps are actually labeled. The exhaust cap has an E in it, and it also points to the front of the motor, the little arrow there. So it's pretty key to keep that in the right direction and put the exhaust cap on the exhaust cam. The cap for the intake has an I after the number 3, and it has the direction of the front of the motor with the arrow. Here I have all my torque specs and my tightening pattern. Bolts labeled T1 must be torqued to 7.2 foot-pounds, and then bolts labeled T2 must be torqued to 14.8 foot-pounds. They need to be tightened halfway in alphabetical order shown on the diagram, and then torqued all the way in a final alphabetical order pass. Alright, that's it. All the bolts are torqued into place and the cams are now in their final resting place, I guess you will. Alright, last thing I'm going to do is take my feeler gauges here and just measure all my clearances and make sure everything is still within spec now that I'm in my final assembly. Valve clearances for this motor are 0.20 millimeters plus 0.04 or minus 0.06 on the intake side, and 0.35 millimeters plus or minus 0.05 on the exhaust side. Alright, dope. All my valve lashes are within spec, which is what I wanted to see. I'm not going to put the valve cover on just yet. We'll move on to the other side and do the same thing and lock all the cams in and measure everything. After installing the cams on both sides of the motor, I'm actually going to wait to install the valve covers. I still have some maintenance I want to do around the motor that I want to take care of first without filling the motor with oil so I can flip the motor over on the stand. Leaving the cams exposed for as long as possible means I can lube them one last time before starting the motor as a precautionary measure. So the water pump here under the tensioner, the whole assembly here is going to come out. I have a new water pump, thermostat, new gasket, and then this like rubber molding, I guess, that goes around the side of the pump. There's a few old crusty rubber pieces here that I was able to find replacement parts for, so I'm going to replace those now. The rubber on this front mount is also completely shot, so I'm going to replace this. Alright, so now I'm going to start putting these oil lines back onto the head. The bolts on these oil lines have a little brass O-ring, so I have a bunch of new gaskets for that as well. Alright, so this is the gasket that I removed here. There's two of them, one on each side of the water pipe that runs across the top of the block. It's pretty flat. I thought that I had ordered the wrong gaskets. So what comes are these rounded gaskets. I guess this is what they're supposed to look like when they're new. So I don't know if over time they flatten out like these ones. Alright, so I have my exhaust manifold here. I have my catalytic converter removed. I was getting ready to replace the stud here that pretty much had to be removed because I kind of fucked up. And so I have a new stud. My turbo wheel is like pretty stiff. There's no play in the turbo. I thought there may be damage to it from when the exhaust valve shot out, but I was assuming out the exhaust. The only thing is, when I look inside my catalytic converter here, there's a net that should have actually caught and trapped the piece of valve that I thought maybe shot out the wastegate, but there's no valve in there, which is now leaving me scratching my head. Where is that piece of valve that broke off? I never encountered it as I was disassembling the motor and rebuilding the heads. Gave my exhaust manifold a good shakedown here. I have not heard any rattling, so I don't think it's floating around in the exhaust manifold. At this point, I mean, what can I do? I don't know. I've done everything I can do to try to find it, and hopefully that piece of valve never turns up. Okay, so I found, I don't even know if you'll be able to see it, but this little piece of metal here, very small piece of metal, came actually out of this sprocket. So apparently I did a little research, and the factory 23 tools that I use to remove these cams can actually cause damage to the cam internally. So I think that's what that little piece is that fell out. I found a company online that can actually rebuild and repair these cams, so I'm gonna send them all out to be inspected and repaired if they can be repaired. If not, these cams cost about $200 to $300 a piece, which is a little bit outside of the budget that I have set aside for this rebuild. So hopefully they can be repaired. It would still cost about $300 to have them all fixed. But in the meanwhile, I'm going to continue installing parts and at least placing parts onto the motor while I wait to figure out what's going to happen with these cams. Alright, so I got my cam gears back from the repair shop, fixed them up, cost about $400 to get 2 of them repaired and all 4 of them serviced. I also bought the correct tool that holds the cam gears from the inside so the mechanism doesn't get broken. So see this little pin here that comes out of the cam? When you put the gear on, it's important that you put it on and then spin it, and then make sure the gear goes on that pin, otherwise you'll wreck your whole gear and pin and everything. So as I tighten the bolt here, I'm gonna try not to let the cam actually open the valve, but just in case, I did move the motor at top dead center. So this tool, it's pretty much patterned to this section here. Pretty much I put it in where it lines up. It's holding the cam gear by the inside rather than the outside, so that should prevent the cam gear from getting damaged again. And then this is my torque wrench. I have it set to 22 pounds. This now has to be turned another 45 degrees. Alright, so I'm just gonna mark a line here and here. This second dot should be about 45 degrees. Now I'm going to continue installing the rest of the sprockets following the factory procedure. Alright, so next up, timing belt. I have a new Subaru timing belt here, as well as new Subaru pulleys and rollers. So first thing I'm going to do is remove all the old pulleys and the old tensioner, and then I'll place the new pulleys, and then I'll torque them down to 28.8 foot-pounds. Alright, next up I'm lining up the timing marks, so that would be a top dead center. So this mark here should be lined up with that mark there. This mark here should be lined up with that notch there. The single line here should be lined up with that notch there. The 2 double hash marks should be lined up with each other here. On the driver's side of the motor, you're gonna line the marks up pretty much like I described on the other side, but on this side, when you turn the cams into the proper position, they're actually going to have to be in a spot where they hold the valves open, so there's gonna be some tension. Actually, I don't know how important it is, but the directions say you should only turn this intake cam clockwise and the exhaust cam counterclockwise. Alright, so I've got the notches lined up here. Alright, so I've got these like little specialty Subaru tools that are supposed to hold the cams in place so they don't spring back once they're set. But I'm going to take my 19mm wrench and then turn the intake cam clockwise until the timing mark lines up. Now with my 17mm wrench, I'm going to tighten this. And then I'm going to spin the exhaust cam counterclockwise so that there's no interference. Now that I have my timing marks lined up, I'm gonna lock that bolt, and this should keep my cams from spinning now. So now for the actual installation of the belt. First thing I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna remove this pulley here. So this pulley actually needs to be installed at the end. So on the belt here, there's this dotted line. So that's where I'm gonna start. All the other timing marks are solid, and the dotted line goes on the center gear. Belt also has a direction indicated here. Arrows are pointing this way. So, and since this is the direction the motor spins, that's the direction I'm gonna install the belt. All right, so there's the dotted line. Gonna set that up. Line that right up with the notch on the gear. It actually has to go under through the tensioner, under this roller. Let's see if I can use this clamp to kind of hold this in place. Next, I'm gonna line this line with this mark. All right, timing belt is on. All the marks are lined up. So I'm just gonna torque this down back to spec. All right, now I can remove my tool here. Alright, the timing belt is on and all the marks are lined up. So now we can pull the tensioner grenade pin. Presai granada. So I'm actually going to keep the pin. This is made of very hard steel. If you ever have to service your timing belt, finding a piece of metal this thin that can hold the pressure from the hydraulic tensioner, every time that I've tried to use something that isn't the pin, it always bends a little bit. So I'm actually going to hang on to this guy. Next, I'm going to be reinstalling the timing belt guards. They require a little bit of Loctite on the bolts. So I'm just gonna tighten this very gently at first. The spec distance between the guard is 1 millimeter to 1.5 millimeters. So I'm gonna just use my feeler gauge here. It's a little tricky because it's not flat, it's on a curved surface. It's a little close on this side. Let me see if I can readjust. All right, let's turn the motor and hope we don't hear any bad noises. All right, we're back at top dead center and everything feels like it's moving like it's supposed to. All right, so next up I'm gonna be installing new valve cover gaskets and new valve cover bolts. So first thing I'm gonna do is remove the valve covers and then clean the edges and make them free of any oil so that the new gaskets will sit properly and no oil will leak through. Alright, so I've got all the oil cleaned off of the mating surfaces here where the gaskets go on to the valve cover. Now I'm going to install my gaskets. Alright, valve covers are on both sides, new gaskets. That liquid gasket looks like it's sitting nicely. So last thing to really do is put the timing belt covers on and the intake manifold. so I ended up snapping the little plastic piece off the top of my fuel injector connector. So I went to O'Reilly's and I bought a new connector. So I already depinned it and I removed one of the wires from this new one already, and it matches this one, so all I have to do, so I just have to swap the good one here for the bad one. Alright, so it's really hard to show here, but on the inside there's a little plastic tab that goes over the metal contactor. So I'm using a pick here to kind of push up on it. Push it up and away from the metal contactor to release it. And it's kind of difficult to do without damaging it. If I had like some eyeglass flathead screwdriver that I could stick in here, it might be a little easier. Alright, so these connectors here didn't match up to the new connector, so I'm gonna have to cut these ends off and then splice it into this new connector, which isn't too difficult. And just for my reference, I marked the red side with an R here so that I know that this side of the connector goes to the red cable. Alright, so the motor is pretty much back together and almost ready to go back in the Subaru. I have a new clutch and flywheel ready to go in. Box got a little smushed here, but that's a brand new flywheel. We just have to get the motor off the stand, pull off the old flywheel, and then the motor will pretty much be ready to go back into the Legacy. I also want to mention I have the front pulley tool rigged up so that when I turn the bolts to tighten them here, the timing belt won't spin backwards, so that this tool will actually run into the mount here, stopping it from rotating backwards, if that makes sense. Alright, so here I have my action clutch, the stage 2 clutch, along with my pressure plate, that iconic action clutch red, and it also came with a throwout bearing. So thank you to my throttle homies for sourcing this clutch for me. Let's get it installed on this motor so we can drop it back into the car. Alright, so I'm switching over to the GoPro here. Last thing I have to do before dropping the motor in is remove the old throwout bearing. And I'm also going to replace the fork and clean up the splines here. The new throwout bearing is on the car, so now we're ready to put the motor back in. The reason the car is half in the garage and half outside is because I don't think the hoist is going to clear the roof here. Alright, Alright, so there's this spline right there. Trying to line it up and get it into the clutch. This is one of the hardest parts of putting a motor back in. I also have the transmission disconnected here. And then I have my jack under the car. And I jacked up the transmission to give me a little more angle so that I can match them up and try to connect them. I've done this before once on another Subaru of a friend of mine. There was like 3 or 4 of us working on it. I've never done this by myself, and this Subaru is a little different than the other one as far as like where the mounts are. I'm just gonna work at it here. I'm gonna turn the camera off and just try to get this in, and then once it's all together, I'll come back and show you. But pretty much I'm just going to use the jack here to adjust the angle, and then I'll use the little leveler here to adjust the angle some more, go up and down until I can get the transmission and the motor to line up and push into each other. Okay, so I was able to get the motor in the car. I've got the front motor mount holding the front of the motor in place, and I have the motor pretty much connected to the transmission. It's not all the way connected. I have some of the bolts here installed on the motor. So I'm gonna jack the car up a little bit, put it on stands, reattach the motor to the hoist just for safety, and then I'm gonna loosen the mounts a little bit and tighten those bolts that I just showed you, and hopefully that should close the gap between the motor and transmission, and then the motor will be fully in the car, and then I can start installing all the peripherals here, like the AC and steering pumps, alternator, and then I'll fill it with the oil and coolant and reattach the starter, and fingers crossed the car will be starting very soon. Okay, so I would officially say that the motor is in the car now. It's all bolted up, all the mounts are tightened up, all the bolts between the transmission and motor are torqued. So all that's left now is to attach a few of the accessories here, finish putting the radiator back in, reattaching a few miscellaneous things, some of the intake stuff, a few little connectors here and there. Once that's all done, I can add in fluid, and I think this thing will be ready to start. Alright, so you're probably wondering why I'm using this 90s Motul. Is it the right oil for this car? Not really. But I'm only using this as a break-in oil, so it's kind of what I had laying around. So I'm only going to run this for about a week before I change it out, so it's not really a big deal. Plus this oil is high in zinc, which is actually what makes it not so great for this motor, because high zinc oils tend to eat up the catalytic converter. That additive also catches a lot of metal particles and things that you want to get out of your motor. That actually makes it a pretty good break-in oil, so that's how I'm justifying using this Motul 90s formulated 10W30. Alright, this is a little bit of a nerve-wracking moment here. So everything's hooked up. This car hasn't run in like 2 years. I'm about to start it up for the first time, hopefully, fingers crossed. Everything's hooked up except the coolant. So I'm just gonna run the car for a few seconds just to see if it turns over and starts, if everything's good. If that goes well, I'll hook up the coolant. This car will be pretty much roadworthy again. I'm nervous. Whew, I don't know why I'm so nervous. Here we go. Oh, what was that? I feel like I just heard the fuel like squirt. Alright, maybe that was just fuel going to the lines, because like I said, this thing hasn't run in a long time. I definitely hear some squirting coming from somewhere. Is there a fuel leak? I definitely smell fuel. Yep, there's a leak. Alright, there's a little fuel on the ground there. Let's try to see where that's coming from. I don't know if you're going to be able to see it, but the fuel injector up here is really wet and covered in fuel, and there's fuel now leaking everywhere. It's kind of wet down there. So I think I'm going to take some of this apart and investigate what's going on. So fuel was leaking from the top section of the injector here. Looks like the gasket in here got pinched. So I'm just going to replace this gasket, and that should fix the issue. Alright, everything is back together again. So I'm gonna go for attempt number 2. Alright, I don't hear any leaks. Woo! Yo, let's go! Alright, I gotta kill it. Yo, it was running, no check engine lights so far. Let's put the radiator in, put some coolant in, and yo, this is so sick, dude, it runs. I'm excited, I'm super stoked right now. This doesn't mean check engine lights aren't gonna come on, but let's put some coolant in it and see what happens. Alright, so I filled the radiator up, the coolant has stopped draining. So I'm going to start the car, and then the engine will start sucking coolant into the rest of the motor, and then I can start adding a little bit more coolant as I need it. I am so excited. This is the first time the car has been running properly since 2020. I checked the dash, no codes, just a TPMS light. So the sensors, it's been so long, I'm sure the sensors in my tires are probably dead. But other than that, the car is running really good right now. The fact that it's running at all, and the only issue I had was that pinched O-ring on the injector. No leaks. It's getting a little late, so I'm gonna kind of clean up for today, and then tomorrow we'll pull the car out on the road and take it for a test drive around the block. All right, so after like 2 years, it's finally time to give this car a test drive. I think it'll do fine. Not so much nervous as I am, it's just like a good feeling to know that this car is pretty much road ready now. So let's start it up and get this thing on the road. I have no insurance or registration right now on this car, so I'm driving a little dirty, so hopefully the popo don't catch me. But I'm just gonna take it around the block, and hopefully I won't have any problems. So I'm gonna let the car warm up. So as you can see, no real dash lights, just the door open, the coolant, seat belt, and then that's my TPMS. So either I'm low on air, or maybe my sensors are out because it's been so long, but that's not a big issue. I did put some air in the tires, so maybe I just didn't pump it up all the way. This car has never driven itself out of that driveway. Wow, I forgot how much I miss driving this car. It's so good. And the clutch feels nice. I can't rev it too high because everything's still kind of in braking mode. But damn, this car feels good, dude. Feels good. Gotta get used to that clutch a little bit. Oh, I'm just so happy right now. I'm just like I'm not saying much, but I'm like just trying to take it all in, just driving this car again. So I have to make a decision. I have to either sell this or the Lexus. It doesn't make sense to keep both, and it's really a big expense to keep both, an unnecessary expense. I'm really leaning towards keeping this thing. Even though it's an unreliable Subaru, it'll probably blow up again once I sell the Lexus. But this car just puts a smile on my face. This car's running again. I just feel so good. I feel so good that all my hard work. Oh, yeah! Oh, phew! That's how I feel right now. Oh. Damn, dude, this is amazing. This is really, really good.